Morning. Another day, another road test. Today, we're doing on the new Apple MacBook Pro 14. Now, we're doing this because my friends just kind of ranted and raved about the new MacBook M1s back in the day.
Yeah, David, any chance you know anybody that can buy the $5,000 maxed out 16-inch MacBook Pro that I bought a month ago? Because that's how good the M1 Macs are. But don't take my word for it. Just go try them out.
Yo, David, have you got the new M1 MacBook Pro yet? Because I've tested it out. It's as fast as promised. Battery life is incredible. So go get one right now. Run your tests, make a video. It might just change your workflow.
And I finally caved and tested them out and was pleasantly surprised at how well they could handle my workflow. So, of course, when the new MacBook Pro 14 and the new MacBook Pro 16 were announced with the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chipsets, I was obviously very curious to see how they did. Now to set the stage a little bit, I have a $2,000, the lowest spec MacBook 14. I also have the MacBook 14 that is close to $6,000, the very highest configuration you can get. And as is the normal with these videos, I'm going to use them throughout my day. We'll test them out in some various scenarios, see how the battery does in various scenarios, of course test the performance, and we'll even compare them to the M1 MacBook so you can know if it's worth the money to jump up to one of these. Also the MacBook Pro 16 Intel version, the one that came out before these, to see if there's a difference there, as well as some of the Windows laptops that I've been testing with my workflow lately. And if you can't already tell from the stack of laptops here, a lot of testing has already happened, and there's more to do. And so, before we get to all that, first things first. Coffee, check. This is Little Neck Outpost, and it's a small offshoot of a big seafood place in a neighborhood east of here called Gowanus, named Little Neck. I gotta be honest, I don't think I've ever gotten seafood here, but they have some of the best egg sandwiches in the neighborhood. In fact, in my mind, it's them versus the new place that just opened across the street called 99 Franklin that are like competing for the best egg sandwich, in my mind. They're both really, really good. But while we're here, let's chat about this new design. Firstly, it's a very squared off, all around design. It reminds me of the original MacBook Pro actually, which is sort of apropos considering that's when they started using Intel chips because of their power per watt compared to the PowerPC chips that they were using.
You know, it's not a secret that we've been trying to shoehorn a G5 into the PowerBook and have been unable to do so because of its power consumption. And one of the things we said when we were switching to Intel was it wasn't just about performance, it was about performance per watt.
And now they're moving on from Intel for the same reasons.
M1 Max delivers all of this with industry-leading performance per watt.
It also matches the new iPhone generations in that respect, but it's definitely striking in comparison to the last generation of Macs. I like it. Now the Apple logo still doesn't glow like it used to, but it is larger. We also have the same scissor-style Magic Keyboard, which is very pleasant to type on, way better than the old troublesome butterfly ones that everybody had issues with. And we now have an all-black casing surrounding the keys, which I kind of like the look of because it's just different nowadays, I guess. And we have a power button that doubles as a fingerprint sensor for logging in, but also for passwords on websites, etc., like we're used to now on the newer Macs. Now beneath that, we have our large Force Touch trackpad, which works great as expected and works the same as any other Mac. Now something I know so many people are excited about here though is the plethora of ports. On the left, we now have two USB 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which I'll leave a link below to a video that I did explaining what that is, but they're basically the most useful ports out in my opinion, and they can be used for docks, fast storage, monitors, and they're fast. Now on that same side, we also have a 3.5mm headphone jack and a new version of the old MagSafe power adapter. The idea originally behind this was that it prevented you from pulling your computer off of your desk when you accidentally tripped on the cord. The cord just let go instead. And while that is a benefit, personally, I just like that I can easily snap it to the side and have it start charging without having to push anything in. On the other side, we have an HDMI port. Another Thunderbolt 4 USB 4 port is on this side, and something I am much more excited about than MagSafe, an SD card slot. I know it's a niche thing, sure, but for someone who records almost all of their photos and videos to an SD card, it makes it so much more convenient than carrying around a dock. And I was just starting to accept the fact that most computers now were losing that slot when Apple decided, after all of these years of professionals complaining to them, they finally brought it back. Now it is a UHS 2 slot, which is not the top standard of UHS 3, but honestly it is what most of my cards and most cards out there for anyone I know doing professional video work are. So it's fine. Now for weight, this 14-inch version is 3.5 pounds, which might sound like a lot, but for a professional laptop to edit video on, or a gaming laptop, which is the route that I usually have to go to get enough power to edit my videos, it's lighter than my Razer Blade 14 and my Surface Laptop Studio, which is also a 14-inch laptop that I was just using. Now before we head out, I was using the base model 14 for an hour of writing and researching and web browsing at half brightness, and I lost 6%. I did that the other day with the highest model to see if there was a difference in battery drain during that type of work, and I lost 5%. So, depending on how quickly and in what part of the minute I actually checked, that's as near as makes no difference the same. It is such a gray, cold day. It is like winter is coming, and I hate it. A little more fall, just a little bit longer. I love fall. This makes me think of winter. This is Leroy's, and I've never been here, even though I kinda have. My old filming studio was across the street from this restaurant, and at that time it was called Alameda. And after trying their simple yet delicious burger, I presented to my fellow studio mate YouTubers, and it quickly became the go-to spot for a quick drink and bite. COVID, though, unfortunately, shut the place down, but Leroy's here opened up in its place not too long ago, and this is my first time walking in. And I gotta say, it feels like not much has changed, but they changed like the wood along the walls to a lighter wood, and it just feels better in here. I don't know why. And on the menu, they have a burger. So let's see how that is. Not bad, but I think we need to get the other guys in here to weigh in. All right, next, let's talk about the screen. All of the new MacBook Pros have the same exact screen tech regardless of the spec. The only difference is the size. So 16.2 inches for the 16 and 14.2 for the 14. They are now using the same mini LED tech from their $5,000 Pro Display XDR. Apple says it can perform at 1,000 nits of sustained brightness. Although it seems like it's really hitting 500 nits for most things that you do, but regardless, it feels very bright. And it can max out now at 1600 nits of brightness when watching HDR content, for example, similar to how the new iPhones do this as well. And those smaller LEDs allow them to better control the backlighting and should make for more contrast. It also supports ProMotion, as Apple calls it, their 120 Hz display, which means that it can refresh the screen up to 120 times a second to make animations and movement of any kind smoother, but also adapt the refresh rate down when things are more static to save battery, apparently as low as 24 Hz or 24 times a second. Now the aspect ratio is 16:10 of usable display. Don't worry, we're getting to it. And the resolution is 3024 by 1964, which is actually similar to the older 16-inch MacBook Pro Intel model. And personally, now that I'm used to 4K displays, I do wish that it had a bit more resolution. But I find that if I go into settings, under display, and change the scaling to show more, that helps a bit. I did it on the 13 Pro as well, and it helped there too. But this extra screen real estate on the 14 even feels better. And I like that I have a bit more room to work with in my editing program, which is the only real place I feel cramped in otherwise. Okay, let's talk about it. We have a laptop notch. Now, people assume that maybe this would house a sort of Face ID sort of option in there, similar to Windows Hello on a lot of laptops now, frankly, and that necessary Face ID hardware, like a dot projector, an infrared camera, all of those other things, would then account for that extra space needed, but it's not there.
We do have a new 1080p, slightly larger sensor for the webcam, and new microphones that sound like this, but that's it.
Now for me at least, I see it as we got an extra tiny bit of space on the display everywhere besides the notch. Hence why the new 16 is 16.2 inches instead of the 16 inches that it used to be. You just get that extra space up there. And the laptop still fits in the same general volume area. And yes, I would have preferred to see a small hole cutout like we see on phones, as that would have just been cleaner. But one, I think Apple might eventually add Face ID to the newer models down the road, and this saves them the cost for the panels since they'll be similar. And two, I think Apple does this on purpose now. The notch, ever since the iPhone, has become a bit of a recognizable design choice, whether you like it or not. and this is no different. Along with the fact that the boxier design and now the notch both match the new generations of iPhones, there's something about the fact that besides that black keyboard casing, this is the easiest way to see from afar if you have a new MacBook or not. And even in icon form, you know exactly what laptop this is, like you do with the iPhones. And looks-wise, you'll either love it or you'll hate it. Now, I will say that functionally, it sits in an area that is used by the menu bar throughout the entire OS, and so actual content will never be up there, and even watching movies, that area is black anyway. Most apps also don't have menus that go that far, and all the ones that I've at least used in my own workflow work fine. The ones that do have a long enough menu bar, just move their items over to the other side. Now, there are some apps that people have pointed out on the internet that don't work well with it, sometimes hiding things behind the notch. And Apple, in traditional fashion, blames the developers and tells them that they need to just fix it to match the new design. Now, do I think that Apple should have built something into the OS that developer apps would just automatically know the display has a cutout? Absolutely. I mean, the fact that I can even put my mouse cursor under it feels a bit weird to me. It feels like it should just stop at the edge, like it does on the edge of the display. But truthfully, in most cases, it won't affect what you're doing. It'll just be a thing if you mind seeing it at the top of the display or not. And there are already a ton of free apps like Top Notch that will essentially put a black bar on your wallpaper to hide the notch for you, or you could just choose a wallpaper that is black up there, and that also does the same thing. And then you just end up with similar bezels to the Intel MacBook Pro. So if it does bother you, there's at least an easy fix. Personally, it doesn't bother me at all. Now, long story short, it's a beautiful display with a very distinct notch in it that you can hide if you want to using third-party apps or a different wallpaper. And now that the MacBook 14 and the MacBook 16 have the same ports and are configurable up to the same specs, your only real big choice is how big of a screen and laptop that you want, as well as the bit extra battery that you get in the 16. But what if you want an even larger screen? Not just 16 inches, let's say over 100 inches. Well, that's where today's sponsor comes in. This is the XGIMI Horizon Pro, and it's a true 4K projector that can produce crisp images even at sizes up to 300 inches. And a super cool feature I noticed while setting it up was that it has autofocus. You just point it at a white wall or this 120-inch screen that I got for it, and it recognizes how far away it is, and it adjusts to keep the image sharp. No more manually adjusting the focus. Love that. But with 2200 ANSI lumens, it's bright enough to be used as a giant no-notch screen for the MacBook Pro in bright daylight, or even used after the sun goes down for a properly cinematic movie night. Speaking of cinematic, it has two 8-watt 45mm full-range speakers by Harman Kardon that get loud while still sounding clear. It also runs Android TV, so there's no need to plug in your computer if you don't want. Just log in and all your favorite Android entertainment apps are there, ready to be played with the slick metal remote that it comes with. Check out the Horizon Pro at the link below, and thanks XGIMI for sponsoring this video.
Down the street from that restaurant is the studio that I share with Michael Fisher of Mr. Mobile and Jaime Rivera of Pocket Now, who are two of the 5 people I used to share the old studio with. That also had Michael Josh from Gadget Match and David Amell from Android Authority, who now works at MKBHD. Okay. Let's talk performance. And in order to do that, we need to talk about the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips that are in these laptops. If you aren't familiar, a quick recap. Apple started designing their own SoC, or system on a chip, for the last MacBook models, but the big points that you need to know is that they replaced the usual in professional creative laptops of having the CPU as one piece of silicon and the GPU as a separate piece. They put them together on one chip. They also took the traditional RAM that is attached to the system and used for multitasking. So like the more RAM you have, the more things you can do at once. And the VRAM, or the memory that is dedicated to the GPU for graphics. And instead put memory in here that the OS, which they make, of course, can then just use for system memory like RAM, but also for graphics memory. And the OS just allocates it as needed to either. So for example, my Razer Blade 14 has an AMD Ryzen 9 CPU with 16 gigs of RAM for the the system, and an NVIDIA RTX 3080 GPU with 8 gigs of VRAM dedicated to it only. This is compared to the 16, 32, or 64 gigs of memory that these chipsets can use, and they use it across both. Now, the difference between the M1 Pro and M1 Max is the number of CPU and GPU cores and the max spec for memory. 32 gigs for the M1 Pro and 64 gigs is the top for the M1 Max. So, enough talking about it, and let me show you some of the data that I've compiled from pointing my camera at a bunch of laptops over multiple days while trying to do real-world work on each and comparing them. Okay, so first let's do some photo editing, but honestly, my photo editing workflow is not terribly intense, and it works just as well on these MacBooks as it did on the M1 MacBooks once an M1 optimized version of Lightroom and Photoshop came out. I'll leave a link below to that video if you want to see how that went. And honestly, it works well on pretty much all of the laptops that I've been testing lately. So things like taking a layer using the quick selection tool, it uses a bit of AI and computation to figure out what you want to select, and then duplicating that, making some adjustments, maybe doing that to another layer and making more adjustments. It all works great as expected. Now for video editing, a much more challenging task for these computers. That's where we start to see some differences. Now, since I actually move into each phone, each laptop, each electronic that I do videos on and try to use it as my own personal device because I feel like that allows me to do a better video, I make a point to be as platform agnostic as I can. So I won't use software that only works on one operating system, for example. So while a lot of video editors who are on Mac will be using Final Cut Pro because it is and always has been super optimized for Mac. I mean, it's a program made by Apple, running on Apple's operating system, on a computer made by Apple, and now on silicon designed by Apple. I am going to instead be using DaVinci Resolve for this because a million years ago, after using Final Cut Pro 10 and then moving to Premiere and now finally Resolve, I found that Resolve is the smoothest editor I've used, and it works equally well across Windows and Mac. So that'll be good for keeping things apples to apples during these tests. So with that said, here I have a project all done for a real-world test that I did recently. It's a 4K timeline playing back at full 4K resolution, and the footage is a combination of my Sony a7S III 10-bit 4K footage, as well as 4K footage from the phone and various photos, some effects, and text. So, using the MacBook Pro 13 M1 with 8 gigs of memory and putting it at the part that most computers have a hard time with here, right before the 4 photos come up with text over them, and playing that back, and it has a delay when playing back from one set of photos to the next. Now, this is bad, as it means editing to the music on the beat is impossible. So, if I change the playback resolution to half though, so we're dropping the resolution down, it fixes that, and it's fine. And doing that in Resolve doesn't affect workflow. It's just one button. I can go down to a quarter if I need even more head, but this fixed it at half, so that's where we'll stop here. Now, bumping up to the M1 MacBook Pro with 16 gigs of memory, we actually have no issue, even at full resolution. Now, using the MacBook 14 lowest model, so that's the 814 core model with 16 gigs of memory, that same part at full resolution plays back just fine. Same for the MacBook 14 top spec, of course, and even the same for the 16-inch MacBook Pro Intel i9 top spec. Now, my Razer Blade 14 with that Ryzen 9 and RTX 3080 I was using to edit for a while actually has a bit of an issue at full resolution, but dropping it down to half resolution solves it. As for the new Surface Laptop Studio, it has a pretty hard time at full resolution, and even at half, but at a quarter it stutters a tad on the first photo, but it's fine after that. Okay, so let's try this 8K footage for another video that I'm working on and put it in an 8K timeline and try to just play it back at that full resolution. The 8 gig MacBook M1 stutters a bit at full resolution, but the 16 gig M1 13 does it just fine. And the MacBook 14 at its lowest spec has no problem, and so of course, neither does the top model. The 16-inch Intel MacBook though, it does it, but it's a little janky. Bringing it down to a quarter resolution though, does solve that. On the Razer Blade 14, full 8K resolution is a little janky, but again, moving that down to a quarter resolution solves that as well. Now, the Surface Studio laptop just freaks out basically, and it tells me that my GPU memory is full, which even though I love this laptop because of its build quality and clever design, and it's really good for photo editing because of that hinge, as is the usual for Surface laptops, they never put in the top of the line GPU in them. Part of me thinks maybe that's to not compete with their own OEM partners and their laptops. I don't know, but I wanted to include it in here just to illustrate how important the GPU is traditionally when we're doing video editing. But the 5 gigs of dedicated memory for this RTX 3050 Ti in here isn't meant for 8K video edit, period. And as such, lowering it to a quarter resolution lets me play it back at least, but it's still too janky to use. Okay, now let's test some tracking. So I'm gonna track the flash on the back of this Pixel 6 Pro in a 19.5 second clip, and let's see how long that takes each computer to do. And here is how long each of the computers took and the average frames per second while tracking. And now clips with deflicker on them, which is an effect that tries to remove the flicker from lights, or in this case, phone screens. And this usually can't even play back at 4K full resolution on most computers, let alone even down to a quarter resolution on most computers. So on the MacBook Pro 13, 8 gig, it's slow. It is slow. On the MacBook 14 lowest model, it's actually pretty close to playing back smooth. It just has some jitters here and there. And now the Pro 14 top model actually plays back fine. Now the top model MacBook 16 Intel version is janky. It might even be worse than the 8 gig M1 13-inch by a bit. Now the Razer Blade 14 is janky at full resolution. The Surface Laptop Studio is, again, not fair to be in this test, but janky. Okay, lastly, let's export that entire project on each of these laptops and see how they vary in the time that it takes to do so, but also how much battery is consumed. And here is how long each one took to render that same 22-minute and 30-second video, and how much battery was consumed during the export, the percentage per minute that translated to, and how long it took each to do while plugged in, to illustrate the difference in power that happens when you are plugged in. Now you'll notice that all of the Macs, as is usually the case, don't vary too much in speed plugged in versus unplugged. And the M1 models have even a smaller delta between those numbers. And then of course the Razer Blade shows a good example of what I've talked about in the past, with sizable difference in performance when plugged in versus unplugged. Okay, now for battery life while editing normally and not doing these like tests. And here is how much battery each one lost while sitting in a cafe editing on them, the same video, for an hour each. Now there is a lot to unpack from all of those test results, and there's a few more things that I want to talk about. So let's head home and we can wrap up our thoughts on it. Now, at the end of the day, conclusions. Now, normally, I feel like myself and most video editors that I know always go for like the top spec version of whatever laptop we're gonna use to edit. GPU, CPU, RAM, all of that needs to be maxed out. But in this case, as you can tell from my workflow at least, and I'm sure a lot of other people's would be similar, you can probably get away with the base 14 model for $2,000 and still get better battery life and better performance in every aspect of my workflow. And even if I like bump up the storage on that model to match my Razer Blade 14, it's still cheaper. Which, if I'm honest, before Apple Silicon, I couldn't say that about a Mac. They were always more expensive for similar or worse performance. At least when you're not using Final Cut Pro. Again, that changes things. Now, of course, if you have the extra cash to spend, then the extra performance you get from the higher spec versions is great, even if there is a little hit in battery life when doing some more intensive workflows, as you saw, for example, in my render tests. Now, I'm not saying don't go for those models. I'm just saying most people who aren't rendering large graphics, multiple 8K videos, etc., won't need them, which again is a weird concept to me as someone who always has had to go for the top spec everything. Then as far as choosing between the 14 and the 16, well, for me, I've kind of realized from other 14-inch laptops that I've been using that that size is kind of a good balance for me between portability and screen real estate. And for once, this 14-inch size has the same specs, the same configurations available as the 16, with the exception, of course, of just a larger screen and a potentially more battery life because of the larger battery. But again, the 14 already has better battery life than any other 14-inch laptop I've been used to using. But subscribe and ding the bell next to subscribe so that you get notified when I will do my MacBook 16 rear world test, and we'll see how those compare and how I feel about it at the end of that. I am though very curious how this is going to light a fire under PC manufacturers who are aimed at creatives, not gamers necessarily, because if you're gaming, you're probably gaming on Windows, and honestly, these chipsets aren't optimized for gaming because of that, so you're better off getting a PC if you're trying to game, frankly. And I'm even more so interested to see how it'll affect chip makers like AMD, Intel,
and NVIDIA, and Microsoft to see how they'll somehow optimize their systems in a world where there's a lot more companies involved in the process than Apple's, owning of the entire stack like they do. There you go. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below of this video, the format, little vlog like I've been doing. Hope you appreciate it. Also, what do you guys think of these new MacBooks and Apple Silicon and the ecosystem as a whole? Always appreciate your feedback. As always though, regardless, thanks for watching.